Hello and welcome to Hydrogen Full Core Press Interview, a feature interview series where we take a deeper dive in all the issues involving green hydrogen and we try to cut through the buzz on what's being called the new oil. Today, I'm delighted to have here with us Jonas Moberg, Chief Executive Officer of the Green Hydrogen Organization GH2, a nonprofit organization headquartered in Switzerland, whose main objective is to accelerate the production and use of green hydrogen over the globe. Welcome, Jonas, and thank you for being here with us today.
It's my pleasure. Hi, Ignatius.
All right, so I'd like to kick off this interview by asking you about your overall comments, your overall thoughts about what's the context of green hydrogen today. We've seen over the course of 2022 that the disruptions caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine that has sort of accelerated the partnerships in relation to green hydrogen, and we've been also seeing over the recent few years the different building blocks to build the capabilities, the infrastructure to produce green hydrogen. Where are we standing today in this matter?
Thank you very much, and it's a big question. I think we see a huge amount of activity in quite a number of markets. Obviously, one of the key events in 2022 was the adoption of the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, which, as I'm sure most people know, that it provides a number of incentives, including a production tax credit of up to $3 per kilo of hydrogen. What the impact of that has been is, of course, that it has driven a lot of activities in the US, where we see a lot of it. At the same time, of course, we are in Europe seeing a growing number of measures to enable to make it more competitive to import renewable green hydrogen to Europe from around the world, and those measures are also starting to have an impact elsewhere. Where is that? I think that you know, given that you're calling from the Gulf, it's obviously interesting to see the activities, not least in countries like Egypt, like Oman, the UAE, Saudi. All are becoming the homes of very large-scale developments. In the rest of Africa, we're seeing very exciting projects off the grounds in Morocco, things becoming quite advanced in Mauritania and in Namibia, to give a couple of examples. They're also, sorry, Ignacio, but they're also in Latin America and in parts of Asia. We're also seeing huge amounts of activities.
Great. And your organization is all about accelerating that. I would say that's a key word, accelerating the adoption and production of green hydrogen. What do you think it's the most, what is in terms of low-hanging fruit? What can we adopt to accelerate this process of production and use of green hydrogen?
Ignacio, it's, you know, we are not going to do the energy transition. We're not going to avoid climate disaster unless we do this. So there is an awful lot of things that needs to happen at the same time. We need to put finance in place. And that's where it's so important to work together with public multilateral banks and commercial banks to enable the financing of these enormous projects, many billions in each of them. We need good standards and rules so we know what that green is actually green. And this is, of course, where projects like the Green Hydrogen Standard that the companies that we work with and that we have adopted comes in. That standard we've just now formatted so it applies also to ammonia. So that is another thing that is truly important. So financing, the rules, working with governments to make sure that we get faster towards financial final investment decisions by making sure that we have the right laws in place, that they have the appropriate fiscal regimes in place. It's a lot about building that capacity to make sure that we can negotiate and truly lift these projects over the line.
It's interesting that you mentioned the need of the climate finance, and also I like to draw some parallels with a bit of the activity you do at GH2, because I believe you're involved in the design and the adoption of standards for green hydrogen, which is also a huge theme right now in order to mobilize more climate finance, finance for energy transition projects, renewables. We've spoken with many banks who say, like, the standards, the taxonomies have to be in place in order to mobilize a larger volume of funds. So where are we standing in this point in that sense for green hydrogen today? Can you see a wide adoption of common standards among different stakeholders?
Do you mean standards for the products or in the financing?
In this case, standards more applied on hydrogen on itself.
Well, so as I said, so everyone wants to see standardization. That's clear. We want common standards. At the same time, we're seeing many jurisdictions adopting standards and definitions that suit them, depending on whether they have large renewables potential or produce more oil and gas or whatever it might be. Then there are a couple of global efforts, such as the Green Hydrogen Standard that we are currently testing and piloting with a group of companies, which in a sense is trying to bridge the gap, the mutual recognition gap. And with that, what I mean is that if you start to produce green hydrogen in say, the Gulf, and wish to import it to Europe, that you have a standard like ours that is based on the EU's rules, so that if you satisfy our standard, you know that you're also satisfying the import requirements within the EU. So that is really the trick with these efforts. What is good is that most of these standards, including ours, are based on the same methodology of calculating emissions. So on that, we're doing all quite well. And there are also some other things one needs to factor in. For example, our standard has a set of wider requirements on land use, on water use, and so on, to make sure that we truly enable a responsible production of green hydrogen.
Yeah, that's another aspect. Like, the emissions is one part of the equation, but you also have to consider other environmental aspects of the hydrogen production, like the land that's being used, the water consumption, maybe. So yeah, definitely. Does that also form part of the all the standards, maybe?
I can only talk for hours, but what I know is that that was an absolute key requirement when it was designed, to make sure that as we've mentioned, water, land, and so on, human rights. There are a number of issues, and maybe one last one is that we need to factor in is what is the development, the economic impact locally. Because of course, unless we actually create long-term jobs in the communities where we're going to produce this hydrogen, and often these are, let's face it, often going to be communities that are energy poor. So we've got to make sure that we create these large projects, often for production and export, that are actually really bringing power and energy to those communities.
And do you see any obstacles at the time of adopting this, in the sense that maybe some parts don't agree with certain aspects of those standards, or they want to have their own, as we've seen, for example, in the finance sector, again, drawing some parallels with ESG, like we see like it's some sort of free-for-all when it comes to regulations and metrics, right? So do you see we're going to, well, first of all, the first part of the question, do you see like any obstacles when adopting these? And also, do you see we're going to a next scenario where we have like a few common standards, or have like many with the same, that follow pretty much the same principles, the same values, let's say?
I think we'll see them follow the same values, and my guess is that there are going to be a couple of key global standards that will emerge, creating a common platform here. At the moment, one of the key things is to actually develop the projects and the final rules of these standards at the same time. And that is why the testing, why the piloting that we are now working on with 6 companies is so important, because the standard determines some of the specifications of the projects, and equally there is still opportunity, excuse me, there's still time to also make some minor adjustments to, for example, our standards. So that's why being part of this early is so critically important.
And I assume that the partnerships play a huge role in coming up with this, sitting different stakeholders into the same table.
Absolutely. So it is very much a question of, under various sort of non-disclosure arrangements, work between the large developers and those involved in the standards work to truly in partnership, everyone learning, solving problems, coming up to solutions that mean that we get our nascent industry off to a good start.
I'm not sure if you answered it already, but where do you find these points of resistance, those main obstacles are when these talks happen?
In terms of obstacles, I think it's just that there are lots of, we are a new industry. There are lots of technical challenges. There are everything from technical issues to legal issues to the risk sharing in offtake agreements. There's a wide range of policy issues here, and some of those needs to be dealt with commercially, but also as soon as some of the companies and hosting governments have found solutions, it's also a matter for organizations like ours to come in and say, okay, let's put that lesson and the solution here out in the public so we can learn faster in other markets. And that is largely what we are about.
And one might think that being this a very early, a very incipient industry, the bright side might be that maybe all the different parts involved are more open to try out new things, take a more experimental approach to see what works and what doesn't work, and learn from the experience. Is that the case?
For sure. Really important. And I also think that we are in quite a unique situation with big companies both competing and forming partnerships, wanting to learn. We've got to remember it's new, it's a fluid situation, and sometimes figuring out new things can result in high transaction costs and delays and so on. And that's something that we really have to work hard to fight against. And one key way of doing it is absolutely to learn. So, for example, the webinar series on contracting, on offtake agreements and so on, that we're running at the moment, we have hundreds of people signed up to each webinar, and I think that reflects the interest across the industry of truly learning fast.
Yeah, and we spoke recently with a representative of the German Energy Agency, and of course, given the energy situation in Germany, the Russian gas supply was completely cut, and they're starting they became more aware about the need of becoming more energy independent, and of course they are starting to invest more actively into green hydrogen, but at the same time they were considering other colors of the hydrogen spectrum, specifically the blue and gray hydrogens as valid options, as less carbon intensive energy sources. Do you think those different colors can also contribute to the development of green hydrogen?
I think it depends a little bit. In some cases, it can and become part of the same growth. In other places, a little bit less so. So I think you need to be specific. I do think it's important to recognize that gray hydrogen that you mentioned, that really contains huge amounts of CO2 emissions. In terms of blue, it's of course the case that there's been a lot of talk about blue, but we haven't actually seen that much of true blue. So we got to make sure that if it is blue, that it is genuine blue, and with that I mean that it really has significantly lower emissions and virtually no methane slippage. So it's very important that we not only have what I've been speaking about today, the green hydrogen standard and definitions, but that others are also coming up with definitions of what is serious blue hydrogen.
Yeah, and we've seen recently also many oil companies, particularly here in the Middle East, in the Gulf, that they're starting to partner with other firms, other oil firms, other engineering firms to develop these green hydrogen capabilities. Seen, for example, ADNOC partnering recently with ThyssenKrupp and also with other international oil firms. Do you think that's the way forward for that's the short-term future for the oil and gas?
I'm sure it is, and it's surely hugely welcome. We need all the infrastructure, all the capacities we can amass to make sure that we have a quick energy transition. And the big oil and gas companies have a lot of the capabilities, the capacities, and the financial resources. So for sure, they will play an absolute key role in all of this. And the only thing we need to make sure is that we are truthful and subscribe, all of us adhere to high standards in terms of what kind of emissions do the different technologies result in, so that we don't oversell anything, because if we do, we're going to be accused of greenwashing and so on. And if we do that, if we end up in that situation, that can have a very negative impact also on zero carbon emitting solutions such as green hydrogen. So the reputation of green is dependent also on practices when it comes to blue and other forms.
Speaking about COP, we've seen in the past climate summit since COP27, 26, sorry, some positive developments when it comes to hydrogen. Also in COP27, it certainly grabbed some attention. And where do you see green hydrogen currently being played in this sort of international forums? Is it being discussed enough, or you think it should have probably a larger focus?
I think it's it is being discussed, and and that's great. But we need to move from discussing to acting even more, and that means that we need to be practical in terms of the financial solutions, in terms of the industrial clusters we develop, and so on. So, yeah, it's been great to see at COP26 and 27. And we now have really a kind of litmus test and credibility, a challenge, but also incredible opportunities with COP28 in the UAE to really demonstrate that these big projects are becoming viable across the world, and that we are starting to build them. So it will be a really good pit stop in terms of taking the check in on progress with them.
And well, you just noticed, like, we've been mentioning the word finance, bringing up the finance topic a few times already, and it seems like it's been the same at the COP scale, right? Like, we've seen that financial solutions have been discussed, possible potential solutions to mitigate climate change and climate adaptation have been discussed over the last 3 COPs as well. And where do you see in the case of hydrogen, where is the main what should be improved in order to foster that climate allocation? Is it a matter of risk, maybe? We need maybe more risk mitigating instruments to be in place?
Excellent question, and something that we work very much on here at the Green Hydrogen Organization. You know, we essentially need we need blended concessionary mixed finance solutions on a scale we've never seen before. That is the only way we're going to really accelerate the energy transition to the extent we need. And in particular, what is important is these kinds of blended solutions for developing countries and emerging markets. Because if we don't supply those, then we're going to see most of the developments in the US and some emerging markets like China and India and so on, for sure, as well. But we are not going to see it in all of them where it has to. So that's why it's really important to work together with the big multilateral banks like the World Bank, IFC, the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, EBRD, and others, and the commercial banks and financial institutions. So we need to scale up the kinds of mixed financing and guarantee instruments in a way that really enables this fast.
Because this seems pretty much like, it sounds like it's a task for as you said, like the multilateral institutions, the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, and the likes, right? Is their task they're doing in this area enough at this point, or is it them who need to do more, or does the private financial institutions need to step up their game?
All of the above. All of the above.
Yeah,
but you're right also in that many big private flows have not been going to developing countries over the last couple of decades, and we need to address that as well. So to some extent, what needs to happen is that these public banks, these multilateral banks, need to enable to provide the guarantees that brings back private capital into these markets.
It's a matter of making marketable or helping it accessing these markets.
That's right. That's right. And so we need totally new forms of collaborations and partnerships. And I'm sure that a lot of very financially strong actors in the Gulf have a very important role to play here. Just as we also need to make sure that buyers of this renewable green hydrogen in Europe and elsewhere come forward with robust, long-term offtake agreements that can form the basis for these investment decisions.
Great. And what would you say is the biggest challenge for hydrogen this year?
I think it's putting these financial packages in place for these very large projects is one of the key challenges for sure.
And in terms of regulation, do you expect what route do you expect them to take?
Well, we see a lot of regulation happening in many jurisdictions, both in terms of importing countries and regions like the EU, but also in a number of producing countries. So there is a lot happening, and governments are learning fast from each other, but we need to do more in that space, both in terms of, as I've said, in terms of production standards, in terms of rules if there is grid connectivity. There is a wide range of things that needs to be in place, both in producing and importing countries.
Well, it seems like we hit the 30 minutes mark already. Those usually go pretty fast. Jonas Moberg, thank you, Chief Executive Officer of the Green Hydrogen Organization. Thank you so much for your comments today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be in touch.